First, let's quickly cover what exactly stretching is. Stretching can loosely be defined as extending a joint to a point which challenges its range of motion. And usually we are referring to lengthening the muscles which limit the joint's range of motion. Furthermore, we can classify stretching into two main categories, static and dynamic. Static stretching is when we get to the point at which our range of motion is challenged and hold that position. This is the most common form of stretching we think of and the one we will mostly be discussing in this video. However, there is also dynamic stretching, which is where we take a joint through a large range of motion via active movement. This includes movements like leg swings, arm rotations, knee lifts, and so on. The main benefit most people typically associate with stretching is to improve flexibility. This refers to the maximum range of motion we are able to achieve at a joint. The definition here is important because this differs from mobility, which is something we will discuss soon. Stretching can influence flexibility in two ways, from a short-term and a long-term perspective. First, let's cover how stretching impacts short-term flexibility. Not surprisingly, stretching increases range of motion immediately after performing it. This meta-analysis found that stretching acutely improved range of motion in almost all of the 47 studies included in the analysis, with the overall effect showing that range of motion increases acutely to a small magnitude. However, this acute improvement in flexibility doesn't last all that long. Depending on the stretching duration, flexibility seems to last somewhere around 1 to 3 hours post-stretching. For example, this study compared the effects of stretching with light, moderate, and high intensities for the hamstrings on knee extension range of motion. It was found that knee extension range of motion increased after all protocols, with the greatest benefits observed with the high-intensity stretching. However, flexibility improvements gradually diminished over a 90-minute time frame, with only the high-intensity stretching showing significantly increased range of motion after this time frame. The mechanisms by which stretching improves acute flexibility are not entirely clear at this stage. Since range of motion benefits are short-lived, this suggests it is probably mostly a neuromuscular mechanism rather than a structural change to the muscle tissue. It has been hypothesized that stretching might desensitize the nervous system to being in a stretched position, delaying the protective stretch reflex. So it is clear that stretching improves range of motion acutely, but what about its long-term effects on flexibility? Well, similar to the acute effects, consistent stretching also seems to improve range of motion from a long-term perspective. This meta-analysis found that chronic stretching routines have a moderate positive benefit for increasing range of motion. But unlike the acute effects, these improvements may be due to structural changes to the muscle tissue rather than neuromuscular mechanisms. We typically observe increases in the physical length of muscle tissue after consistent multi-week stretching. For example, this study assessed the influence of calf stretching on range of motion and muscle architecture. It was found that after 12 weeks of stretching, fascicle length of both the medial and lateral gastrocnemius increased significantly in the calf being stretched. So it is pretty clear that stretching can improve flexibility. And while this is important to some degree, it isn't the entire story when it comes to performance and function. Instead, we are probably more concerned with what I would call mobility. This refers to the ability to move through and control a range of motion. So flexibility is one component of mobility, but we don't just want to be able to reach a position, we want to develop the coordination and strength to control a range of motion during relevant movements. But how mobile do we need to be? Well, this really depends on what the specific mobility goal is. Mobility requirements differ depending on the goal and purpose. We only need to be as mobile as is required for our goals and tasks. For general health and function, simply being able to bend down, walk upstairs, kneel, reach overhead, rotate your torso, and so on is probably sufficient. Alternatively, a weightlifter is required to get into a front rack position and an overhead squat position while holding as much weight as possible. And a figure skater is required to get into extreme ranges of motion while balancing, jumping, and landing on ice skates. Furthermore, just being able to achieve a range of motion doesn't necessarily mean you are strong and mobile throughout that range. For example, getting into full hip flexion while lying down on a table doesn't necessarily mean you have the strength and movement competency to perform a full depth squat under control with a loaded barbell. So the question is, does stretching improve mobility? Well, if you simply don't have the range of motion to get into the required position, then stretching will probably help. This will allow you to improve the absolute range of motion you can get to. But if your joints are already able to achieve the desired range of motion, then extra stretching probably isn't going to help all that much. In that case, it is more about practicing the movement in the way you want to perform it. This will improve your coordination to control and balance throughout the range of motion, improve joint and connective tissue tolerance throughout that range, and increase strength in that range. Furthermore, exercise in itself will usually be able to improve range of motion for the joints that it uses. And if the exercise challenges a particular range of motion, the flexibility benefits can be similar in magnitude to stretching. This meta-analysis found that the overall body of evidence shows that resistance training improves range of motion to a similar magnitude to that of stretching. And as a more specific example, this study compared the effects of performing the straight leg deadlift and Jefferson curl exercises versus traditional static stretching on flexibility. It was found that both groups increased their sit and reach range of motion to a similar magnitude, around 6 to 7 centimeters. So for mobility benefits, I would say that challenging range of motion via exercise is going to be more beneficial. This is because it can not only improve flexibility, but you are also simultaneously practicing movement and control throughout that range. So your overall performance, function, and strength are likely to be superior via exercise-induced mobility gains rather than stretching alone. That being said, stretching can be used in conjunction with exercise in order to achieve a desired range of motion. If you don't initially have the flexibility to achieve a specific position required for your sport or exercise, then stretching may help you get there faster. And this can be applied from both an acute and chronic standpoint. You might stretch before exercise for the acute effects of being able to get into a certain position so that you can competently perform the exercise. For example, a soccer player might incorporate a little stretching into their warm-up routine to ensure they have the required range of motion necessary to run, jump, swing their legs, and so on. Furthermore, chronic stretching may help someone develop and maintain the structural flexibility adaptations required for performance in their sport or event. For example, a gymnast may perform a regular stretching routine to help develop and maintain a high level of flexibility, since it is beneficial for their sport. However, this is probably only really required for fairly extreme exercise. In most cases, people will have enough or develop enough flexibility and mobility for their required goals just from consistent practice of that exercise. On a related topic, let's now look at how stretching can impact performance. There are two ways in which stretching might impact performance, in the short term and long term. First, let's cover how stretching might impact immediate performance. In many cases, we find that stretching immediately before exercise can actually inhibit performance to a small magnitude. This systematic review found that static and PNF stretching, which is a form of static stretching, performed immediately before exercise tends to inhibit performance of both speed and power related outcomes as well as strength-based outcomes, with larger reductions seen for strength. However, dynamic stretching seems to have minimal influence and potentially a positive impact on some performance outcomes. It was also observed that when a stretch is held for a longer duration, the negative effects are greater compared with shorter duration stretches. However, when incorporated into a dynamic warm-up routine, the negative effects of stretching on performance seem to be mitigated or potentially completely eliminated. So as long as you aren't performing long-duration static stretching immediately before maximal exercise with no additional warm-up, then performance is unlikely to be significantly inhibited. For example, this study compared the effects of incorporating stretching into a comprehensive warm-up on athletic performance. On 4 separate occasions, 20 male team sport athletes performed a low-intensity general warm-up, followed by either short-duration static stretching, long-duration static stretching, dynamic stretching, or no stretching. This was then followed by a higher intensity warm-up before going through speed and power testing. It was found that during various tests of jumping, change of direction, and linear speed, performance was not significantly different after either of the warm-up routines. But what about for chronic performance outcomes? Can long-term stretching performed separately from exercise improve performance? Strangely enough, stretching seems to induce some degree of muscle growth and strength development independent of exercise. For example, this study compared the effects of pec stretching for 15 minutes per day, 4 times per week, versus chest fly resistance training for 5 sets of 12 reps, 3 times per week. After 8 weeks, it was found that both interventions resulted in similar increases in pec muscle thickness as well as isometric strength. Furthermore, similar magnitudes of improvement are observed for power-based exercise too. This meta-analysis found that chronic stretching interventions tend to improve muscle strength and power to similar magnitudes. However, stretching is obviously not an efficient way to improve strength, performance, or muscle mass. Training itself is far more effective than stretching for most performance outcomes. But a more relevant question is, can stretching promote additional performance improvements when performed in conjunction with exercise? Well, I'm not aware of any studies which compare the effects of stretching in conjunction with a training program to stretching alone. But I would assume that stretching would only have additional benefits to exercise in activities where the athlete is unable to achieve the desired range of motion required. Stretching may help to achieve and maintain high flexibility levels, which may be favorable for a sport or event. But apart from these specific events, I'm skeptical that stretching is going to provide additional speed, power, or strength benefits when training is already being performed. Another common use for stretching is for its perceived recovery benefits. Stretching is sometimes performed after exercise with the intent to improve recovery for subsequent exercise sessions. But does stretching actually improve recovery? There is surprisingly little evidence on this topic, but from what we have, stretching doesn't seem to be all that beneficial for promoting recovery. In terms of resistance training, stretching after lifting doesn't seem to speed up the time for strength to recover or reduce how much soreness we experience the following day. This was established in this meta-analysis, which found that in the small body of evidence, there were no significant differences in strength recovery or muscle soreness compared with no specific recovery interventions 24 hours after resistance training. Furthermore, stretching after athletic training also doesn't seem to improve the recovery of speed or power type performance either. For example, this study compared the effects of performing either static stretching or active recovery after a basketball training session. It was found that there were no significant differences in jump height, heart rate variability, muscle soreness, or perceived recovery over a 24-hour time frame after training. So overall, stretching probably doesn't do much for recovery from a physiological perspective. However, if you enjoy the sensation of stretching for whatever reason, I can see how it might have a slight psychological benefit for promoting your perception of recovery. And the last common implementation of stretching is for its influence on injury risk. But can stretching actually reduce injury risk? Well, in some cases it might, and in other cases probably not. It seems that dynamic stretching performed either as a warm-up or in conjunction with a warm-up may reduce injury risk slightly compared with not warming up at all. Although it isn't clear if this is a result of the dynamic stretching itself or other components of a comprehensive warm-up. Furthermore, we are probably going to achieve similar effects of dynamic stretching by simply doing a warm-up involving the movements of that activity we are about to engage in. For example, doing a couple of warm-up sets before resistance training will take the muscles and joints through the range of motion required for your subsequent sets. But when it comes to static stretching, it doesn't seem to have any additional benefits for reducing injury risk when incorporated into a comprehensive warm-up. For example, this study compared the effects of including either dynamic stretching or dynamic and static stretching into the pre-training and pre-match warm-up routines of 34 US high school boys soccer teams throughout a season. It was found that injury rates were similar between interventions, with slightly more injuries observed in the teams including static stretching. Furthermore, static stretching alone doesn't seem to have any notable benefits for reducing injury risk compared with no warm-up at all. This was seen in this study, which compared injury rates in over 2,000 active adults when performing or not performing static stretching before and after various forms of exercise for 12 weeks. It was found that injury rates were similar between those who performed stretching or didn't. It was found, however, that static stretching did seem to reduce the prevalence of bothersome soreness, but this term wasn't specifically defined in the paper, so I don't really know what that means. So the question still remains, should you be incorporating stretching into your regular routine? Well, stretching does seem to improve flexibility, and if you cannot achieve the range of motion required for a specific activity, then regular stretching can probably help to acquire it. However, you would also need to develop the coordination and strength to move through and control that range of motion using regular exercise utilizing that new range. Also, simply performing exercise which challenges your range of motion can be just as effective as stretching. And if you already have the necessary flexibility and mobility for whatever exercise or daily activities you perform, then stretching probably isn't necessary. In terms of exercise performance, we probably want to avoid intense static stretching performed immediately before exercise. However, some stretching is fine to implement into a comprehensive warm-up as long as it is not the last thing you perform in your warm-up before maximal exercise. And it would be preferable to implement dynamic stretching rather than static stretching for pre-exercise warm-ups. Furthermore, it isn't really clear at this stage if stretching can help to enhance long-term performance outcomes when implemented in addition to a training program. When it comes to recovery, there doesn't seem to be any physiological benefits to post-exercise stretching. However, if you enjoy stretching or you find it relaxing, then it might help with psychological readiness. And in terms of injury risk, a dynamic warm-up is recommended to do pre-exercise to reduce injury risk. Dynamic stretching is one way to achieve this, but simply doing a warm-up involving the movements of the activity we are about to engage in will probably have similar effects. However, static stretching alone, or in addition to a dynamic warm-up, doesn't seem to reduce our likelihood of getting injured during exercise. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.